lack of civil legal services for the poor has been a problem for decades. And recognition of the problem probably began with Roosevelt's New Deal. And it was during that New Deal era that you might remember a young Democrat congressman from Texas. He actually resigned from Texas so that he could work on Roosevelt's New Deal youth program, Lyndon B. Johnson. Some of you might remember his distinguished career as a congressman and senator, but when he became president, he did not forget his roots. He did not forget what inspired him to public service. When President Johnson took over for the assassinated President Kennedy, he made the commitment to fulfill Kennedy's dream of equal justice for all. In his first State of the Union address, President Johnson declared a war on poverty. I think now it ought to be a war on greed, but he declared a war on poverty, emphasizing that the war against poverty will not be won in Washington. It has to be won in the field, in every private home, in every public office, from the courthouse to the White House. And to help fight this war, President Johnson created the Office of Economic Opportunity. And I believe Senator Dennis Chavez from New Mexico was very instrumental in that happening. Ultimately, in 1974, this was President Nixon, created a National Independent Legal Services Corporation. And that was intended to disperse federal funding to civil legal programs. That was funded with $90 million. President Carter, when he was president, more than tripled that amount of money. And if you actually took into account inflation, in order to do what President Carter was wanting to do, Legal Services Corporation would have to be funded by more than 3 times. Over $800 billion would be the funding. But it wasn't meant to be, because after President Carter came President Reagan. Not only did he want to kill civil legal services, when he didn't have that avenue available to him, they reduced funding to Legal Services Corporation by 25%. And that was in the 1980s. That's when we started to think about, we need an alternative. If we're not going to have the funding from the federal government, we need to think about fundraising. And Karen's brainstorming and the board was tremendous. I thought we all worked toward that. We worked with the other organizations to make sure that we were not depleting one another's resources. And that was very important. The state bar even got involved in 1995 and did their own work, created some pro bono committees where they would actually create pro bono forums. They have pro bono clinics, things of that nature. That's 1995. Guess what happens in 1996? Again, another serious cut to funding for legal services corporations. And that's why we are so dependent on the attorneys in New Mexico to fund legal service programs. Because it's not like medicine, where you want to make contributions to see if we can find a cure for a dreaded disease. People don't think about equal access to justice. And so it's incumbent on us as lawyers to do that. And then my colleague, Justice Maez, along with beloved Sarah Singleton, chaired the Commission on Access to Justice. It was created by the court in 2004. They spent 2 years gathering data that revealed that only 20% of those eligible for legal services in New Mexico were being represented. One lawyer was responsible for up to 5,000 cases a year. No lawyer can handle 5,000 cases a year. And it doesn't matter that they may not be always complex, because there are complex cases. But a lawyer just simply can't do that. And the types of problems that lawyers and legal aid deal with are basic human needs. Housing, access to healthcare, consumer problems, benefit programs, education, employment issues, and of course, there's always domestic violence. And you need representation for that. The court did form pro bono committees, and we approved a pro bono plan. We did lots of things as a court, even with rulemaking. But my blessing at the time was the opportunity to work with Kim Posich. And I remember Chief Justice Maez used to love to refer to me as Junior Justice. And it became a real term of endearment for me. I thought, if I ever had a prestige plate, it'd probably be JR JUSTS. But it never happened. Actually, the prestige plate I now have on my truck is ALS XSUX. I think you get it. Kim left us as a result of complications with ALS, but he was a tremendous advocate for low-income families. And he and I got to work together lobbying the legislature for the equal access funds that we now have. And I got to tell you that it was partially successful, but it was not that easy. I remember testifying, and legislators would take issue with me. They would ask me, well, why are we in this situation? Well, I knew nothing other than the truth. So I explained to them Reaganomics. And that President Reagan was the first president that not only wanted to destroy the program, but reduce the funding for it. And they did not like me attributing it to, some legislators didn't like me attributing to it. But even worse than that, legislators would ask, why should we fund programs that are going to sue us? And I thought, well, the answer is simple. Accountability. To make sure that the executive is efficiently and effectively carrying out the policies of the legislature. It's about the people. Well, that didn't satisfy some of them, but that has been a battle, and it remains a battle for some of our organizations. And so we have talked about the justice gap in New Mexico, and we've advocated for it. The studies that we've done have been important. The advocacy has been important. But your education and training as lawyers makes you uniquely qualified to not only represent the poor, but to also help our state and our nation by identifying the special needs that we have. Our democracy works best when everybody participates. And indifference deserves very little. But I'll tell you, with the work that you have done, you have been everything but indifferent. You have been at the table to make sure that poor people are represented before the legislature and the executive branches, as well as the courts. You did not ask yourselves, what's going to happen to me if I decide to advocate for the poor? You asked yourself, what will happen to the poor if I don't advocate for them? Your work is a great example of how to love your neighbor as you love yourself. As Senator Robert Kennedy once said, the true power of America does not come from our gross domestic product or our military might, but from our values and endless effort to live up to the ideals that forged this great nation. Well, the ideals of equal access to justice is to respect every American and afford them a fair opportunity to build the best life possible for themselves and their families so that they too can enjoy the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Thank you to all of you for all you have done for the low-income families in New Mexico. May God bless you.